You know, there is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, "Be without food, but don't be without shelter or home." You know, shelter is very important than food. You know, I was working as much as you can work. You know, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here. Since its creation in 1986, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, has helped finance nearly 4 million affordable rental homes and served countless low-income households. LIHTC is a cornerstone of federal housing policy, but we know that demand for affordable housing far outpaces supply. And in today's housing crisis, we need to make every federal dollar go further. Here at the Terwilliger Center, we've been thinking about how to maximize the number of high-quality LIHTC units produced per federal dollar and how to make these units affordable for longer. Members of our advisory committee use these principles to develop recommendations to reform LIHTC, and we sent these recommendations in a letter to Treasury Secretary Bessent in April. In July, the reconciliation package made historic enhancements to LIHTC, permanently increasing the 9% allocation and lowering the private activity bond financing threshold to 25% starting in 2026. These enhancements are expected to produce over 1.2 million additional affordable rental homes. With these enhancements in place and the need for affordable housing greater than ever, the question is, where can LIHTC go from here? That brings us to today's conversation. I'm thrilled to be joined by 4 people who have not only studied LIHTC closely, but who have also been instrumental in its implementation and its evolution. I'm joined by Emily Kotick, CEO of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, Daniel Hornung, former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council and currently a Fellow at the Urban Institute and at MIT, Sharon Wilson-Janot, President of the National Multifamily Housing Council, and Shekhar Narasimhan, Managing Partner of Beekman Advisors. Shekhar, who's a former chair of the Virginia Housing Development Authority, is also a member of the Terwilliger Center's Advisory Committee. To set the stage for our conversation today, I'll turn it over to Shekhar.
Thank you, Laura. First and foremost, this is a stellar panel. It's a very hardworking one, I want to tell you. and I'll explain that in just a moment. So first of all, I'm very glad to be a small part of this, and I want to thank the BPC Terwilliger Center for Housing and the entire team for putting this together, but more importantly, for staying on this issue like many of you have literally for decades. So my goal is set the scene and then throw you a challenge as you begin your conversation with this hopefully extraordinarily motivated audience. So the industry writ large really had three main things on the wish list, literally for decades. We got 2 out of the 3. That's called victory. It's kind of amazing because I think the day after, a whole bunch of us were just kind of pinching each other just to say, did it really happen? Did we really get the cut restored to the LIHTC allocation? Did we really get the private activity bond financing threshold lowered? And by the way, we got permanence. I don't think people understand the significance of that, because in 1987, when we first got the tax credit, it took till 1995 to get that made permanent. Then it took from 1995 to 2025 to get permanence for the increase and the change in the private activity bonds. Permanence and these changes didn't happen by accident. It happened because of persistence, execution, and proof that this program works, and that it works in all 50 states. It works through the state HFAs and the housing finance agencies and the local development community and the nonprofit community. Countless people took countless members of Congress and Senate to groundbreakings and cutting ribbons and meeting residents. So it's the army that made it happen, okay? We had an army. Now, we also got, in conjunction, it felt like almost, a dramatic increase in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's footprint in this market on the capital side. So there are two sides to this. The government can appropriate money and say, here are the credits. You still need the debt. You still need buyers for the credits. And then you need the people to actually build the housing and execute it and manage it. You will hear from parts of that bipartisan army today, Emily, Daniel, and Sharon. They are brilliant and frankly, extremely hardworking. But I want to just talk to you a few minutes about the real work of making all this truly meaningful. So on April 16th, the BPC Advisory Committee, and led by Dennis Shea, sent a slew of recommendations in a letter to Secretary Bessent at Treasury. We wanted to do this knowing there would be conversations about legislation, but we wanted to do it in advance because I think we felt, yeah, even if we got that, how would we execute? So I think there would be the most consensus in this group about two of the recommendations, one regarding NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, the duplication and time delays that are caused by NEPA reviews, multiple parties, and how you streamline that, and also changes that are needed in Davis-Bacon and the weight scales and how those are measured. Because what that does is, frankly, in many markets, not only impede construction, but increase the cost. And so the bottom line is, in order to produce those 1.22 million units that were projected by Novogratz, which was a huge sales pitch, this is what we're going to do in affordable housing. We need LIHTC to run as efficiently as possible. This is not just because there's a huge need, which will not just be met alone even by this, but also to keep and maintain the strong bipartisan support that LIHTC now enjoys. Frankly, we really cannot afford any more stories about units costing $1 million to build under LIHTC. We really can't use any more stories about it took 17 years to build a project and 15 layers of financing. We need streamlining. We need simplicity. We need more done with the same dollars, which we now have an increase in. So we have to touch and influence what often in housing terms is called the third rail of housing politics. And that is duplicative and unnecessary additions to the building codes and restrictive land use regulations. And you're going to hear about those. We also need to expedite projects, especially those using new construction techniques. Why is it that the housing industry still uses essentially the same techniques as we did 50 years ago and often the same materials? Is it a lack of innovation? No. Is it a lack of application of those because of systems and barriers? Yes. So we need to change that. And further reforms are also needed to improve the investor appetite for LIHTC, because we need these credits to be selling for the highest possible price so that we don't need the additional layers of subsidy to meet the target markets that we're trying to serve. So how do we do that? We've got a bunch of ideas. We'd love to hear more, but more importantly, let's talk about things that we can get done now, okay? For example, how do we expand the universe of investors beyond banks and their CRA appetite? Some examples: how do we create a liquidity exchange so that if people don't want to hold credits and want to redeploy their capital in credits, they can do so during the 10-year, 15-year term? How do we do retail-friendly reforms to bring in high net worth investors? How do we harmonize the 10-year period when credits are harvested and the 15-year compliance period? Because that seems to also increase the risk for certain investors and limit the number of investors. So in protecting the gains that we've made, we need to ensure that the 500,000 units that are coming out of the 30-year compliance period, believe it or not, that this program's almost 40 years old, that we can have the use extended for those units with property tax abatements, which come at the local level, of 4% credits. So the work that lies ahead is we have the advantage, frankly, guys, of having the wind behind our back. We have more resources, we have more tools, we have a consensus in many, many states that they need to do more. The challenge I will throw you is, how do we deliver those 1.2 million plus units while we maintain affordability for another 500,000 over the next 10 years? With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Laura and to this extraordinary panel. Look forward to hearing you.
Shekhar, thank you so much. That was a great frame setting. So before we jump into the discussion proper, I just want to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to and expand on Shekhar's framing remarks.
Okay, well, I'll jump in. Emily Kotick, I'm the CEO of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, and I just want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for having this important discussion. BPC has been a great partner in advocating over many years for this huge victory that Shekhar just laid out. And one thing I'd like to add is, I guess from our perspective, we only advocate for the low-income housing tax credit. So obviously we've been getting the question quite a bit after the huge win that we had just a few months ago of what do we do next? And Shekhar laid out in a great way that there is so much more work to be done. And it's not because we got 1.2 million affordable homes as a potential impact of the provisions that were just enacted. And it's not that we're coming back saying now we need to do, double that expansion right away. Now we're going to do 3 million. What we really need to do is take these huge tools that we've just been given and shore up that investor demand. So that's part of what we're working on now, in addition to getting across the finish line some of the really popular pieces of the LIHTC proposals that haven't gotten done yet. So we are looking forward to working with many of our partners in the industry, because it's going to be probably a more varied agenda than we've had in the past. We were really laser focused on getting these two pieces across the finish line that we just did. Whereas now it's probably going to look more like a collection of maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe a dozen different policies that all help different aspects of the low-income housing tax credit, and especially on the investor demand side. But before we get into all of that, I just want to emphasize one other thing that Shekhar mentioned, which is the impact of what was just signed into law on the low-income housing tax credit really is astounding. So for context, the last major win for the low-income housing tax credit was when the minimum 4% housing credit rate was set in 2020. And the impact of that was estimated to be 126,000 affordable homes over the next 10 years. And prior to that, the last win was in 2018, when we got the first allocation increase in the program in a decade. and the impact of that was estimated to be 27,000 affordable homes. So here we are talking about 1.2 million affordable homes over the next 10 years. That is 10 times the impact of the last major win for the housing credit that was really industry changing, but more importantly, life changing for the residents that are going to be in those homes. So we really do have a lot of work to do as an industry to get these homes financed. These provisions are starting to go into effect very soon. Even in the case of the bond test, some developments are already able to take advantage of it now. So we're excited to get to work, but really everyone who was part of this advocacy effort should be very proud of what we've all accomplished together.
So I guess I'll go ahead and turn to Sharon, following up on that vein. Even with these enhancements, some developers sometimes still struggle to make LIHTC projects pencil out, especially so in high cost or high barrier markets. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what additional policy changes or tools could help developers close funding gaps and make more projects viable?
No, thank you, Laura, and again, also thanks to BPC and everybody on this panel. This is a good group, and I want to echo many of the things that Emily and Shekhar already said, and I'm sure Daniel will chime in with similar thoughts as well. You can't underestimate the opportunity that we have. I think the reason I'm so glad BPC is having this conversation, because now we've got to make good on those commitments and those promises that we've made. In my former life, I was one of those deal lawyers who did LIHTC deals back in the beginning in the mid to late 90s. When you were doing a deal back then, you had your LIHTC equity, you might have some debt, and you often have some sprinkling of public housing or Section 8 subsidy in it, and that was it. The deal went. Now, as Shekhar mentions, you have 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 different sources of financing because the costs have gone up and the gap between what the credit can provide and the cost of actually producing a unit has gotten greater for all the reasons we've discussed. Time is money, and time is the thing that government and policy can impact. We can't implement everything in the market based on policy initiatives, but we can impact time. So I think the letter that BPC did actually outlined a number of things that can reduce that time frame. Having a baseline QAP that's much more streamlined, that multi-state developers can build systems around and count on year over year over year. States that have additional resources and underwrite all of their resources at once, not program by program by program. Really getting different sources of financing to work together and rely on each other's underwriting of the deal rather than having each source of financing work separately and sometimes against each other. I've always said I've always measured the cost per unit of a deal in the LIHTC space by how many people were on the intercreditor call. And you could sometimes have 40, 50 people on the intercreditor call because you had so many people working in different sources of financing. So what we can control, but we can't control all of it, but what we control over here in the policy side is time. So anything we can do to reduce time, reduce risk, and will enhance the quality and will shorten that cost gap it's really the biggest challenge for us.
I want to expand on, you mentioned QAPs, qualified allocation plans, and turn to Daniel for this one. Your recent work at the Urban Institute did a great job highlighting kind of cost drivers and allocation patterns across states. So Daniel, in your view, what have you seen as the best practices in terms of administering LIHTC, particularly in terms of boosting unit cost efficiency or extending affordability?
Yeah, and I'll just echo that it's really great to be with all of you, and thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this. If I may, I do just want to make one kind of framing point before getting to your question, which is, I think it's just incredibly important that we're here talking about these bipartisan provisions of the recent legislation that are, I think, going to make a real difference, and particularly if they're implemented well, and particularly if we kind of focus on cost effectiveness and efficiency going forward, as is the kind of main topic of this panel. I do think that, I have to start by mentioning that, some of the less bipartisan or not partisan pieces of the bill, I think, are unfortunate because they are going to harm some of the residents of the affordable housing units that we're talking about in this conversation, things like making it more difficult to access Medicaid and SNAP benefits. But that's not the topic of this conversation. I think that on the question of what is working well and what states should be doing more of as they think about efficiency in the allocation of the credit, I think it's really important just to start with the fact that you want to get to cost effectiveness, but you don't necessarily want to get to the cheapest production possible. And by that, I mean, there are some really important things that we need to keep in mind that are important priorities when it comes to allocating the credit that sometimes cost a little bit more. For example, when it comes to things like land costs, we actually want to make sure that we're locating affordable housing in places that are close to good jobs, close to transportation, close to opportunity, good schools and the like. And those kinds of things sometimes do cost more in terms of the underlying land value. I think some of the effective ways that states have thought and are beginning to think even more about efficiency and cost effectiveness in LIHTC, I just kind of put into three very broad categories. The first, as folks are thinking about how do you limit some of the hard costs that have really grown significantly. I like the way that Sharon really separated out what we can control versus what we can't control. On some of the hard costs, a lot of times people don't acknowledge that costs have gone up a lot for affordable housing. They've gone up a lot for market rate housing in recent years for reasons that are, not at all specific to the low-income housing tax credit. When it comes to the way that states allocate, though, I think there is an important opportunity to think about what are the ways that requirements have built up over time that might actually add cost without achieving the public purpose that tax credit allocating agencies are hoping for. And so I think that this is a really important moment now that we have these permanent resources to really have an important conversation about that. In the category of soft costs, the second category, I think that Sharon's point too about the degree to which you have so many layers of financing, that has in part led to higher soft costs as well. And so part of the hope, I think, in this period could be that you, in the same way that you have a really serious conversation about how to reduce requirements in order to reduce hard costs, that this is an opportunity to look at things like various fees that add up in a deal, more in some places than others, where states and tax credit allocators could actually play a role in trying to incentivize lower costs and cost reduction. And then the third, more blue sky category that I think is important to emphasize here, and this gets to something Shekhar was mentioning about kind of innovative construction techniques and the like. LIHTC is this, huge pot of resources, the federal government's largest intervention into the supply side of the housing market. And, I think states and others really have an opportunity to think creatively about how could you use that to change the government's role in a little bit more towards being a customer. And by that, I mean, in places where we consistently hear, that it's very difficult for innovative building techniques like modular, where you need a better sense of who your future customers are going to be. I think there's an interesting question of whether states could play the role, either with LIHTC resources or frankly with other resources, of doing things like pre-committing to purchases, pre-committing to really create a market so that we actually can stand up some of these more innovative techniques. That wouldn't just reduce costs for the projects at issue now, but it could actually, over time, create a cycle where you no longer need the government to be the central player in modular and other innovative building techniques, but instead where the government is playing a role in standing up a new market.
So you touched on these soft costs, and I want to get to another perhaps more indirect form of cost that has to do with this broader regulatory climate. I think we've touched on, the fact that when LIHTC finance projects receive other federal funding sources, they can become subject to a slew of regulations, whether it's the Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements or NEPA reviews. So I'd love to turn to everyone on this one for your perspective on how these regulations affect project costs and development timelines, and then how to strike this balance that you, Daniel, mentioned of how to reduce some of the maybe negative impact of these regulatory barriers from a development perspective while making sure that affordable housing is safe and high quality.
Laura, if I could jump in on that just a little bit, it's not just the federal regulations, it's state and local regulations and some state and locally driven programs that oftentimes are the biggest culprits here. There was a recent study that just came out this spring that was done by the Rand Corporation in partnership with the Cooper Institute and others that compared the cost of building in 3 different locations in California, in Texas, and in Colorado, and looked at the LIHTC costs. And the costs in California between market rate and LIHTC almost double. Texas, less. Colorado, about the same. So that tells you that some of that is in the state local intersection in the LIHTC space, where the states have a lot of opportunity to add things to the QAP and do other things. But a lot of that also is in how those states have do or don't have different programs that marry well with the LIHTC already, where they aren't created separately or they don't have them at all. And 2, what's going on, and Daniel and Shekar both mentioned this, what's going on at the local level in terms of just general building regulation that could be incentivized through LIHTC for jurisdictions that reduce it. Maybe they get bonus LIHTC allocations if they have a jurisdiction that's already friendly to reducing housing costs. There are ways that you can use the federal government, not just cutting regulations, but as an incentivizer to reduce a lot of those things that are happening on the local level. So I wouldn't discount what's happening down there either.
Completely agree with Sharon, and also I just think we have a good opportunity with the deregulation kind of energy that's happening right now to address some of these regulations that have been extending timelines and driving up costs for a long time. In addition to the ones that you mentioned, I would also raise the Build America, Buy America regulations. While LIHTC is fortunately exempt from those specifically from Davis-Bacon, there are a lot of these sources of funds that are often used in LIHTC projects that are subject to these requirements. And I've been collecting examples since it is starting to get some more attention on Build America, Buy America, and these stories about 94 units for seniors that are ready to go, except they've been waiting for a Build America, Buy America waiver for the HVAC system for 8 months. And so, here's the definition of shovel-ready developments that are just being held up kind of with this, this gummed-up process to issue waivers to the Build America, Buy America requirements. So there really are some good opportunities at the federal level. And I think also, one thing we experience quite a bit advocating for the housing credit is we get a lot of good ideas for things that we could do to improve the program, and they all require changes to the tax code. And we always remind everyone that, this win that we just achieved was huge, and we do have the wind in our sails here, but it also took 5 years to get done what we just accomplished with the expansion of the program. And that was even with having, at least at one point, the most popular bipartisan tax bill in the entire Congress. So whereas some of these legislative proposals are very good ideas, there was just a major tax bill passed with a lot of permanent tax policy. And as we're holding this webinar during a government shutdown, it's hard to see when the next bipartisan tax bill or even partisan tax bill is going to be. So anything that the federal government can do to say, hey, we just expanded this program in our flagship signature legislation here, and now we're going to issue some subsequent regulations to make it easier to build affordable housing. I think there's a great opportunity. So whether that's HUD, Treasury, Things like what FHFA just did when they increased what Fannie and Freddie can do to help drive up demand, and that'll help make the program more efficient. We hope we see more of those types of actions over the coming months and years.
And I just add, at the state and local level, just agree with everything that's been said. Impact fees is another category where, many times you actually see such a strong opposition to ever raising property taxes. And so basically the way that the part of how folks are raising revenue is by using impact fees, which are in effect a tax on new construction, which isn't what really we would want to do in a housing crisis, obviously. On the federal policies that you asked about, I think that NEPA is a good example. In the prior administration, I think we made some progress there in trying to do a categorical exclusion for conversions, basically on the grounds that if you are converting a building from one use to another, you shouldn't have to do an environmental study again. I think there's more, though, that should be done there. The idea that my colleague Aaron Schroyer has put out that we should be doing a categorical exclusion also for infill development strikes me as a very good idea. That if you're building in a kind of area where there's already density, adding to that density actually has real environmental benefits in terms of providing housing for people without long commute times and the like. And so, that's a place where I think we should very seriously consider moving to further limit NEPA. And then on Davis-Bacon, I think there's some interesting low-hanging fruit before you even get to the kind of wage part of it. If you just talk even about the compliance costs associated with Davis-Bacon, bringing more predictability to it, I think that you actually could make some real progress in a way that would both be positive on the housing front and wouldn't adversely impact workers who are working on those projects.
Now, Sharon, I'd love to turn to you just to get your broader reaction on what changes to LIHTC would make it less of a headache for investors.
Again, I think a lot of the BPC did a wonderful job in outlining many of those in their letter to Treasury. More uniformity on QAPs would be a great opportunity. Creating more predictability around the funding cycles in different states. Right now, different states' funding cycles vary pretty dramatically based on what their credit situation is, what the demand is. SHAKER opening up this idea that's been talked about a while. Let's open this investment opportunity up to others and more people, and also create an exchange opportunity so you could move the credit around a little bit depending on where demand was and where units could get in the ground. So there's a lot of things you could do within the credit itself. But again, there's no one fundamental thing that's going to make magic and going to open up this resource in the way we'd like it to see. We have to be diligent about all of these things because it's together at the federal level and at the state and local level that we're going to be able actually to utilize these to the promised value that we think they can all achieve.
Question as well. It is going to be a number of things. There is one that we're excited about because it does seem to have some good momentum in this Congress. And while it is difficult to see, what the bipartisan legislative opportunities are going to be over the coming months, there was a rare moment of bipartisan agreement in the Senate Banking Committee in August when they unanimously passed the Road to Housing Act out of committee. And we understand the House may take up, if not the same legislation, at least some of the concepts and some of the similar proposals from what the Senate did, and they're looking to do something bipartisan as well. And one of those pieces, which doesn't require a change to the low-income housing tax credit directly, but could have a pretty big impact, is a proposal to lift the public welfare investment cap for what banks can invest in public welfare investments like affordable housing. Low-income housing tax credit accounts for about 80% of public welfare investments. And there are a number of banks that are some of the larger investors in the program that are hitting that 15% cap. So lifting that cap from 15% to 20% will allow the banks that are already investing in the program to do even more, which, as Shekhar said, we do need to bring in some new investors as well. But if we've got some of the ones that are already looking to do more, they're just limited by this regulation. And there's already precedents for having lifted the public welfare investment cap during the George Bush administration. It seems like time to lift that cap again now that banks are starting to hit that. One thing we've also been looking at, and there's not currently a legislative proposal in Congress to do this, but we're hoping there will be, is to provide some of the flexibility for low-income housing tax credit investors that we've seen for other types of credits. So the proposal to allow the credits to be carried back 3 years, so investors just have more flexibility to apply the credits to different tax years rather than just the one. That's certainly made some other credits more attractive. And so that's another kind of easy, no risk, should be low cost change, just the sorts of things that can have these tweaks. It's not going to be the same kind of scale of getting the 1.2 million more affordable homes, but it really could make the difference between some investors using their tax capacity to invest in the credit versus elsewhere. And the last one I'll just mention, which again, we're hoping will start becoming part of the list of bills out there, is one to make it so that investors can go beyond the current limitation on tax capacity to invest in the housing credit and other community development credits. So there, again, are just these kind of more arcane flexibilities that we know will make a difference both for some of the current investors in the program, but also some potential investors who may find the credit more appealing if we're able to make some of these tweaks.
Yeah, I thank you for touching on the Road to Housing Act. I think it's another very important milestone. I'd love to turn to everyone just to talk about what these enhancements are going to mean on the ground and also some of the effects that they've already had. So HUD recently announced changes in their multifamily mortgage insurance premiums, reducing the premiums and eliminating a couple of rate categories. So I'm wondering what further administrative changes you expect to see and you would like to see in this vein.
So maybe I'll start with kind of a state administrative change that I think would be really interesting. I think one of the things that you find striking when you spend some time reading through QAPs is the degree to which, and I don't really mean this as a criticism, but the degree to which they can feel like a document that has been written over many years that has had more and more provisions added to it. Because if you think about kind of the incentives of putting together those documents, you have people come and ask you to add different requirements, and you have people come and ask you to add different priorities, and you do that, and then over the course of many years, it becomes quite robust, shall we say. And so I do think there is an opportunity in the state lens for some credit allocating agencies to set aside some of the new resources, maybe on the 4% credit side and the bond side, and set aside some of the new resources to basically say that the main goal for allocating those new resources is going to be some combination of cost minimization and unit maximization. And one of the things that could do, I think, is not in a top-down way, but create a dynamic where you have states across the country really experimenting with what are the drivers that can help get to most efficiency and get to most unit production per credit dollar. Again, taking into account some of those really important things like where the unit is located, and in many instances, wanting to maintain that there are going to be some credits set aside for certain vulnerable populations. We don't want to change any of that. But I do think experimenting with set-asides on the efficiency front, on the cost minimization front, could go a long way, and using this period not just as a way to try to make the best use of those resources that Congress just allocated, but really to enshrine in the program a sense that there's going to be a bunch of innovation over the next few years to think about how we improve the program for the long haul.
And just dovetailing on that, there's already bills floating around to improve, streamline the uses for 2 block grant programs that the federal government allocates, but the states and localities have a lot of latitude to do, which are the CDBG program and the home program. The House Financial Services Committee, on a bipartisan basis, Chairman Flood and Ranking Member Cleaver have worked hand in glove with their subcommittee on trying to take those 2 resources and really narrow their focus and not provide quite as many different uses for those funds, but narrow their focus to housing production, which is the thing that we need the most, and even more specifically, have those resources more streamlined for affordable housing production and ensuring that states and localities are incentivized to do that. So some of it is certainly dropping regulatory barriers, but at the same time, incentivizing, using the federal resources that we have, in addition to LIHTC, incentivizing states and localities to use that more specifically for this tremendous need that we have at this time, is something that's also being considered.
Now, on a slightly different vein, Emily, I'd love to turn to you. I think, the enhancements give us an opportunity to renew our ambition to address some of the weaknesses of LIHTC, some of the opportunities for improvement. And so what comes to mind is when critics say that LIHTC is simply too complicated, or that it doesn't do a good enough job reaching our lowest income renters. So I'm wondering how you would respond to these critiques and what adjustments you think could address them.
Yeah, sure. So the easiest one is on serving extremely low income renters. A lot of people don't realize that more than half of all LIHTC homes are home to tenants who are extremely low income. And, one of the things we hear is that the tax credit equity doesn't fully bring down rents low enough. And so often these other sources of funds are needed, which is a criticism that, we don't really hear about other housing programs. All these programs are designed to work together. So the fact that one program on its own doesn't provide, every possible solution to every possible household type isn't a weakness. I wouldn't characterize it as a weakness of a program. It's just, the fact that the housing credit is the program that breaks ground. It's really the only way we're meaningfully adding to supply. And if you're serving certain populations with the housing credit, then yeah, you might need to layer on some additional sources of funding so that you can reach the lowest income populations and often the supportive services they provide. Now, there is a proposal that's part of the Bipartisan Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which didn't make it across the finish line in the latest tax bill, but is still one of the ones that is a really high priority for a lot of members on both sides of the aisle. And that would allow you to do more with the tax credit equity to reach those lower income households. So it would provide a 50% basis boost for properties that are serving extremely low income households. And that's a larger basis boost than is currently available to any other type of property that's currently eligible for the boosts, or even anything proposed to be eligible for the boost. So it would make a huge difference and allow you to use less of those other sources of funds. But it really is, it's something we hear often, and I just encourage everyone to check out the HUD LIHTC tenant database, which says it's about, the latest data they have is about 51% of housing credit households are extremely low income. As for streamlining, I think one of the pieces that we just got done in the reconciliation legislation will go a long way. When we lowered the bond test from the 50% bond financing threshold to 25%, that's just one example of an unnecessary arbitrary hoop that housing credit developers were having to jump through, and also kind of wasting bond cap that could have been going to other affordable housing projects and now will. So that's one major win that should really improve the efficiency of the program. We've got a lot of other proposals out there. While we did get these 2 pieces done from the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, it is a 27 provision bill, and there's a lot of streamlining and good governance in there. Won't review all of the other 23 or so provisions I haven't mentioned yet, but there's a lot we can keep doing to say, this program is it's 39 years old this month, and we've learned a lot, and we've been shopping this set of proposals for 10 years now. Some of which have a huge production impact, like the ones that just got signed into law, but some of them are just kind of, obvious streamlining type initiatives that have really just been waiting for the right tax bill to come along. So we're gonna keep at them all, and hope that, rather than have policymakers look at this and say, okay, we've taken care of affordable housing, we do hope they look at it and say, we just got started on finally doing something on affordable housing. And so while taking care of many of the other issues we've talked about, like investor demand, that they also look at some of the ways to help underserved populations, like extremely low income tenants, like rural communities, like Native American communities. All of these proposals are out there, and we're gonna just keep working to get them all across the finish line.
I'll mention one more, if I might, in the context of reaching those really low income folks in the tax credit program, which sometimes it is criticized for not getting to those very low income people on a permanent basis. Creating more opportunity for project basing of Section 8 on an ongoing basis to create that real affordability would go a long way to create even broader incomes within the tax credit program. Under the current Section 8 program, housing authorities are capped at what the percentage of Section 8 they can use in project basing. That was really at a time when there was a lot of concern about impeding people's mobility in the program. And now that we've gotten so many greater allocations for that, and the real problem here is a shortage, if we can start creating those units that are effectively permanently available, high quality units for very low income people, by doing a better job of marrying the Section 8 resource with the tax credit source, we can also do a better job of serving a broader base of incomes as well. So I'll throw that out too.
On those two really important points. If you think about a, very low income family, let's say a single parent with a child or two earning $20,000 a year, right? If you just do the math, that household is going to need to spend less than $500 a month on rent for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And so, that household is going to need a voucher. There's no question about it. And, there are different kinds of voucher resources that household could need, but it's just very difficult to envision a situation where that household doesn't need a voucher. And I think it speaks to, yes, we need new flexibilities on things like being able to project base more vouchers. And I think there's some important progress, bipartisan progress on those priorities in the Road to Housing bill. But we also just need resources for those programs. And I think it was a good, it was a positive development that you see bipartisan agreement right now in Congress to say that you need to hold steady or increase voucher funding, both housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance, project-based vouchers. We need to find ways for those programs to work better. But I almost like to think of the problem of housing for very low-income families as somewhat separate from the questions related to housing supply higher up the income distribution. And that's because, we just very much have both an income problem and a housing problem at that part of the income distribution. And so you need interventions that both get at income and at housing. And so we, I think, have to stay focused as policymakers on both of those.
I think that raises another very important point on which I'd love your diagnosis and that of the rest of the panel. The concept of encouraging true mixed income developments rather than isolated affordable housing projects. So how would you say we're doing at that? And then what adjustments do you think could encourage a world where LIHTC developments are part of true mixed income communities?
Well, this is an interesting one. This is actually a place in my in that short paper that I wrote where I have had a lot of interesting conversations with folks in the field and have gotten pretty mixed feedback. I think that mixed income and mixed income using LIHTC can work really, really well in high cost, high rent markets where places like New York City, Boston, where you're basically able to use the market rents to cross subsidize the affordable rents and have the credit go further. In other parts of the country, and maybe the majority of the country that are not those high cost cities, it tends to not work as well. So I think, this is a place where, as much as I would love kind of federal reforms to the LIHTC program, you do want to be sensitive about market differences on kind of what to do in those high cost places where we know that mixed income can work well, both in terms of projects penciling out, but also importantly in terms of the benefits for the low income residents in terms of economic opportunity. I think that, where I was going earlier about kind of set asides and using set asides in QAPs to encourage different kinds of practices. I think that New Jersey is a state that currently has a set aside in its LIHTC allocation for mixed income. And my understanding is that works well. And I think that's probably a policy that some states that have similar markets could consider, because, to your point, I do think that in places where the math works and you can use mixed income to actually get more housing built per credit dollar, there are also really important economic co-benefits associated with low-income households having the opportunity to live closer to good jobs, closer to transportation, closer to good school options. So, it's a place that I hope we can see further activity in the years ahead.
I would just add one of the legislative achievements we've had in the last few years. I think we're going to start, and we already are starting to see quite a few more mixed income developments as a result, is the income averaging flexibility, which was enacted in 2018, but didn't really start taking off until a few years later because of the regulations that were required to implement it and kind of some twists and turns there. But it is a very common election now to use the income averaging flexibility, and it allows developments to serve households up to 80% of area median income, so long as the average income limit in the property is 60%. So you're going a little bit higher, but that also allows you to serve tenants at the lower end of the income spectrum. And really part of the driver behind enacting the proposal was to make more types of developments financially feasible and to help the higher rents from the higher income tenants offset the lower rents for the lower income tenants, which also goes back to the previous question about, how do we serve more tenants at the lower end of the income spectrum? This is a great way to do it. It also helps more properties become financially feasible in rural areas where you're dealing with a narrower population. And so if you have one narrow income band, it's going to be hard to fill it. Whereas if you can expand beyond that, you'll be able to draw from a larger population. So there were really a lot of benefits to the income averaging flexibility. And it's something that, like the provisions we just got enacted, it's permanent. We don't need to continue fighting for it, but we are only really a few years into implementation of that. And I think you're going to see a lot more evidence of the mixed income housing that can be produced as a result of that over the coming years.
Now, before we turn over to audience questions, I had one of my own for Sharon. Some have talked about this idea of blending LIHTC with other sources, whether it's ESG-driven equity or CDFI lending. I'm wondering if you have found any examples where this type of alchemy is working, and then what regulatory shifts do you think would pave the road to allow those models to scale a little bit better?
Sure. I mean, it really is, as I think what you're hearing, the top line of this whole discussion is that the housing situation in this country has shifted and changed, where there is a housing shortage now at every segment of the market. It's different though, and Daniel made a great point. It's very different at different segments of the market. And there is changing and shifting investor appetite because now the investor market is segmented in different buckets because the housing investment need is segmented at different markets. So I think we need all of these tools, and we need the investor market that is segmented for ESG or for impact or for whatever it is to find their fit within the LIHTC program and the other federal regulatory programs we have. But what that means for LIHTC is it has to be flexible enough that we can absorb all of the different types of investment capital that's out there and make it work in partnership with LIHTC so we can leverage it all better. But I think we are finally, and I'm not saying this is a great answer, but we're finally in a place where, because the housing situation is so severe in all markets, that we're really understanding the treatment of and identifying these different groups within the housing space that need attention. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions anymore. And we have to stop treating LIHTC like it is. We have to stop treating Section 8 like it's a one-size-fits-all solution. We have to start thinking about how we match and marry different segments that meet certain market demands.
We have an audience question here for Daniel. This person is wondering, given your experiences during the last administration, what did you see as some of the biggest political or technical barriers to advancing LIHTC reforms on a federal level?
Yeah, and it's a fair question. We spent a bunch of time, as Emily was alluding to, getting out regulations for income averaging, and you find that doing rulemaking from legislation a few years ago actually takes a lot of time versus putting in place kind of new important affirmative priorities. I do think there's a structural barrier on LIHTC, though, which is that if you look at the kind of statute and look at the way the program is constructed, there really is so much that is delegated to the states in terms of how the allocation happens. And so, there are real opportunities for the federal government to try to streamline, particularly getting to a point Sharon was talking about earlier, as it relates to how LIHTC might work together with other federal sources of subsidy. But there were, kind of a range of proposals that we would receive related to rulemaking within the LIHTC program. Both, things that really ranged from streamlining to more tenant, kind of tenant protection, to more kind of how the LIHTC program could work together with some of the green energy programs. And, structurally, it's difficult to do really significant substantive rulemaking in the LIHTC program without an act of Congress. And so I think, a lot of federal policy folks in the housing space end up focusing, more of their time and attention on other programs than on LIHTC, which is, kind of one of the things that motivated me to write the urban paper that I wrote recently, which is just that I find it odd that LIHTC is by far the biggest subsidy for supply side subsidy for affordable housing in the country. And there's actually, outside of this group, there's not that much conversation about it because so much of it really is a state by state program. And then you get into 50 plus QAPs that is very difficult for people to parse sometimes.
And if I can also just jump onto that, and add on some of the congressional gridlock that we've encountered. I think part of the fact that LIHTC is a tax program and needs to run through a tax bill severely limits the opportunity to get anything done. So whereas bills like Road to Housing, that may well get done this year, and it doesn't necessarily need to wait for kind of the perfect brokered compromise on a dozen tax issues. But even when there was almost a LIHTC expansion last year as part of the Smith-Wyden bill, the LIHTC piece of that tax package was about $5 billion-ish in a $70 billion tax package. So LIHTC was not the driver. It wasn't a housing bill. And LIHTC was kind of stuck in this sort of a hot potato between much broader political issues, the child tax credit, the business tax credits. And similarly, when we were successful at attaching LIHTC to the reconciliation bill this year, the investment was about $16 billion, which is tremendous for affordable housing and the biggest investment at one time in the program ever. But it was part of a multi-trillion-dollar package. And so it's part of the, even though there's all of this support for LIHTC, as I mentioned, at one point it was the most popular bipartisan tax bill in the Congress, if there isn't a broader negotiated tax bill to attach to, it's really hard to get these things across the finish line, even with all the support. So we keep at it, but it is more difficult to move tax provisions than a traditional housing, banking, financial services bill.
It's such an important point. I feel like I spent not an insignificant amount of time in government having conversations with Emily and Sharon and others about how supportive we were of the LIHTC expansion. But also, from where I sat at the National Economic Council in charge of, housing issues and tax issues, it was also very important that we, be in a negotiation trying to advocate as much as we could for the child tax credit. And so to that point, if the LIHTC committee of jurisdiction was, financial services and banking instead of finance and ways and means, maybe I think it might be a little bit easier in some ways, because so much of the kind of challenging, not bipartisan politics in DC happens in the tax committees.
And with only 1 minute remaining, I'll do a last rapid fire question that your point raised, Daniel. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on whether there are kind of untraditional partners that we think we should bring into the LIHTC reform coalition, either more on the state level or from a business leader perspective? What chances do we have to kind of broaden this umbrella in more creative ways?
Well, I think that's one of the exciting things about this conversation right now about how you make the credit work better. There's this really important conversation going on around the country about abundance and how you make government work better to build. And because of the kind of some of the issues we were just talking about with how the low-income housing tax credit often is kind of viewed as this in-the-weeds thing, we haven't yet had this abundance-like conversation about LIHTC. And I think that, bringing in folks who are interested in that conversation to be a part of the conversation here could be a real opportunity for getting more housing built, but also working towards a set of housing policy solutions over the long run that can really holistically get to the housing crisis problem that we have.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think from a workforce perspective, and we've always known that people need to live where they work or close enough. And we're starting to see a lot more bipartisan support and from a lot more parts of the country, because there are examples. For example, our lead House Republican sponsor, Darren LaHood, has a Rivian plant in his district, and there just aren't enough houses for the people working at the Rivian plant to live. And as more economic opportunities are coming to areas that didn't have as many before, I think there is becoming, it's not just the affordable housing supply shortage, it is the supply shortage generally, but we happen to have a tool to really increase supply and for people who need it. So I think, we've always seen an engagement from chambers of commerce and so forth, but I think we're going to see more different types of organizations getting involved, just because of the growing recognition of that we can't grow our economy in the ways that we want to if people can't live near jobs.
I'll add another one. We've closed down the federal government largely over healthcare. Housing is healthcare. The data is in. It's long research now over the last decade or so, particularly for those low to moderate income households that often have chronic health conditions and with a little bit of preventative care. And those are the people that are being served by the Medicare and Medicaid programs that are the ones that are costing so much money. So our investment in housing, particularly for low to moderate income people, is going to save us long term on the healthcare side. So, and some of the managed care companies over the last decade or so have started to get this, and increasingly they are becoming part of the housing ecosystem and investing in the low-income housing tax credit. But we haven't always made it easy for them. So creating more back and forth between the healthcare system and the credit and the housing system generally is daunting to many, but it's also a tremendous opportunity.
I have never been more sad to announce that we are unfortunately out of time, but I do hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists. I think this was an unrivaled discussion, and I really appreciate you joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.